All right, so in this video, we're going to be discussing the executive branch in both Mexico and Nigeria. So some pretty strong similarities within the two countries, which is why they're grouped together. So both of these are considered to be presidential systems. So you'll notice a lot of similarities to each other and also a lot of similarities to the United States. So like the United States, they combine the head of state and head of government positions kind of within the presidency. So like the US, you see broad presidential powers and a sort of constitutionally, at least, a separation of powers that exists out and sort of checks on the presidency. But in general, just a strong executive branch, especially when you compare it to countries like the United Kingdom, kind of in parliamentary systems, which we'll look at later in the year. So for both Mexico and Nigeria, we are also looking at kind of the role of the presidency as they transition from authoritarian rule to a presidential system within a liberal democracy, or in the case of Mexico and Nigeria, an illiberal democracy, so one that hasn't fully developed yet. Both of these countries have a history of executive dominance. In both countries, the legislature and the judicial branch are emerging as checks on the president, but not quite there in terms of in actuality. So in both countries, the position of president kind of manages this immense patron-client network in sort of all of the interesting ways in which that develops within each country. So we will talk about both of these kind of within this, but also as we talk about civil society in both Mexico and Nigeria. So first, we're going to look at Mexico. So the Mexican president is the man you see here, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. And some characteristics about the Mexican presidency. So like we said before, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. And the way to really conceptualize the position of Mexican president is some really strong similarities to the United States president in terms of the role of the president. Unlike the United States, however, there is no vice president. So there's sort of an interesting way in which a new president is selected by Congress if the kind of current president is impeached or dies in office. So, but there is no vice president. So, like we said here, AMLO is the president starting in 2018, and he will serve until 2024 because Mexico has one 6-year term. That is one of the defining characteristics of the Mexican political system, is this kind of staunch use of term limits. So some really interesting discussion around kind of the benefits and the downsides of term limits. But Mexico has one 6-year term limit for the president. And that's going to be really important given that the president has lots and lots of power. So that's kind of one of the only things going in terms of checks on the power of the presidency, or at least it has been in Mexico's kind of history. So when we look at how the president is elected, we'll talk about that in a separate video. But the president is directly elected because Mexico has more than one or more than two parties. Oftentimes, the president is elected with kind of less than 50% of the vote. The last president, Enrique Peña Nieto, was elected with about a third of the vote. So they use a first past the post, which is to say, like, the person who gets the most votes wins, no matter what. Which, sounds simple, but we don't have that system in the United States, and they don't use runoff elections as well, which is a comparison to Nigeria. So AMLO is kind of an aberration within Mexico because he won with 53%, which is a crazy landslide sort of by Mexican standards. So he is a very powerful president because the president in general in Mexico is powerful, but he also came in with sort of giant majorities in Congress and sort of this huge national mandate in 2008. So he's kind of the center of the Mexican political universe. All right, so kind of like we said before, Mexico has had a president kind of throughout the 20th century, but that was sort of they weren't necessarily a presidential system in that they were more authoritarian. So they had a president, but the president was usually handpicked by the last president. This was called El Dedazo, which means the tap or the unveiling. So they were usually really close to the current president. Although Mexico has some really interesting dynamics within the 20th century about kind of the power sharing between left and right within Mexico. And like the US, must be 35 and a naturalized citizen. All right, so talking about presidential powers within Mexico, like we said, very strong. sometimes called the 6-year monarchy because of the sheer power of the presidents within Mexico. So if you think about the United States, the U.S. president has a lot of power, and sort of adding on to all of those, you also have the ability to initiate legislation into either house. So unlike kind of the U.S., where usually that is done by a house, or a Senate member, and oftentimes there isn't like a direct initiation for legislation by the executive branch. They also, like the president of the U.S., have broad foreign policy powers, manage appointments, create and manage government agencies. This next one is really important. They make policy by decree. So this is a lot like when you see or hear the term executive order, except it kind of extends even beyond the realm of sort of what executive orders do, which that power in the United States has been growing as Congress is becoming less adept at making laws. That power has grown a lot in the United States in recent years, but even stronger in Mexico. So the president can make policy by decree. And similarly, when we get to Russia, we will also see this as a power within the Russian presidency. So that the use of decree, and that can even go so strong. There are examples of like the president initiating an income tax by decree, which obviously that would be a kind of a power reserved to the legislative branch of government in the United States. So kind of other things that look president-like: grant pardons, veto legislation, names cabinet, and can replace them. They play pretty fast and loose with judicial appointments. So you can have lots of examples of Mexican presidents kind of pulling in and out judges based on their loyalty and things like that. So some really interesting kind of dynamics. They also, kind of what we said in terms of the major powers that exist within the presidency, they manage the patronage system, which is this huge sort of informal power structure that exists within Mexican politics. So sort of the patron-client network that oftentimes can be used to grant favors and enrich people that exists. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So yeah, like we said, we see the legislative branch growing, the judicial branch growing, but Mexican president is still sort of the paramount figure within politics. All right, so going a little bit even deeper into this, the president, one of the big jobs of the president is to oversee sort of a huge bureaucracy, most of which lives in Mexico City. So this is mostly patronage driven. You do have some implementation of like civil service tests and things like that kind of in recent years. But Mexico has really, 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 really strong interest groups that basically spent the whole 20th century kind of being really close to government. So the one of the ways in which the PRI, which was the ruling party within Mexico in the 20th century, stayed in power for so long as they were really good at keeping a lot of civil kind of unions and companies and things like that really close, and that kind of growing the bureaucracy. So there are still lots of remnants of that today. An example of this are called parastatals, which are essentially government-owned corporations or agencies. So the largest of these is called Pemex, which is essentially an oil company that is owned mostly by the Mexican government. So in recent years, we have seen the number of parastatals get trimmed, as well as sort of the kind of a lot of schemes related to privatization of these. But we still haven't seen sort of the full economic liberalization of Mexico. You still have a lot of these that are owned in part by the government. All right. So kind of thinking about some of the differences that exist within Mexico and Nigeria. Let's see.